梅村みずほ、世界に存在が知れ渡る。
やっぱり政治っていうのは遠く先々のことも考えて、今できること、今やらねばいけないことを考える必要があると思うんですよ。今の大臣のご答弁というのは大変辛辣な言葉で申し訳ないんですけれども、ご発想が平和だなと思っております。我が国は郷に入りでは郷に従いの国なんだっていうことをですね、はっきり言っていただかなければならないんですよ。
And they think that, for example, a woman sitting with her legs open is asking for it, quote unquote, or if you're wearing a miniskirt, you're asking for it, quote unquote. For them to think that anything other than that is so foreign and in their mind debased as well, were to read the Quran verse for verse, or just read the verse of women that's dedicated to women, that in itself can give you a sneak peek into how problematic.
11月27日参議院にて参政党の梅村みずほ議員により行われたイスラムの土葬土地問題に関する国会質疑の模様を取り上げた X のポストがトランプ大統領ジュニアのバロントランプはじめ世界中の人々にリポストされ拡散されまくっています。なぜ世界の人々は彼女の発言に関心を持ったのか。それは今西洋の多くの国でイスラム教徒との対立が激化しているという背景があります。また最近ではニューヨークの市長にイスラム教徒であるゾーラン・マムダニ氏が選ばれ話題になりました。こういったこともあり、イスラム教徒に関する情報には世界の人たちが敏感になっているのです。以下引用リポストの一部をご紹介しますね。政府関係者ははっきりと述べた。日本では火葬が伝統です。土葬を望むなら遺体を母国に戻して埋葬すればいい。これこそ本物の真の強さだ。アメリカも見習うべき。バロントランプ。他にも日本の女性たちは過激な征服志向の移民に対して筋の通った意見を述べているという投稿や、日本は譲らない国会審議の場で梅村みずほ議員は、日本では仏教や神道の伝統により亡くなった人の 99% 以上が火葬されていることを理由にイスラム教徒の埋葬地拡大の要求を退けたなどといった投稿がありました。ではここで改めてその国会質疑の模様をダイジェストでご覧ください。公衆衛生上の問題などから国で禁止にすべきと相変わらず切れ味鋭くズバズバと進言する梅村議員に対して、果たして厚生労働大臣の答弁はどういったものだったのか。それでは早速どうぞ。
日本ではかつて宗教上の理由から火葬が禁止されていた時代もございました。ほぼ 100% 土葬だった日本がほぼ 100% 火葬に移行した背景には感染症蔓延など、いろいろな歴史があったように思います。もう大臣にお尋ねします。今外国人の方に配慮して土葬墓地を整備してほしいというような要望も出てきておりますけれども、むしろ日本の環境変化を鑑みればですね、公衆衛生上より一層の土葬規制さえ必要と考えますが、いかがでしょうか。
厚生労働大臣。
墓地の整備等につきましては、各自治体におきまして、地域の風習や住民が信仰している宗教の状況、墓地の候補地やその周辺環境、地域の実情を踏まえつつ、住民感情にも配慮いただきながら、丁寧に検討、調整いただきたいと考えています。
梅村みずほ君。
はい、ありがとうございます。今現在はやはり各自治体のご努力もあって、公衆衛生上の問題は目下ないと思います。けれども今後ですね、土葬というものが広がっていくと、そういう問題が表出してくるかもしれないということを申し上げておきたいと思っております。現在、地方においてムスリム用土葬墓地の整備を検討する動きが出始めておりまして、周辺住民から地下水、農業用水などへの影響を懸念する声、あるいは墓地が呼び水となって、ムスリムの方の集中を招いてしまうではないかというご懸念など、さまざまな声が私どものもとにも届いております。でもお困りでしょうから、国としてこの際ですね、土葬を原則禁止としてはいかがと考えますが、大臣いかがでしょうか。
各自治体におきまして、地域の実情に応じた必要な規制が行われるものと考えております。現在、土葬を禁止するということは考えておりません。
地方自治の裁量によってですね、この先どれだけ土葬墓地が拡大していたとしても、このムスリム用の土葬墓地というのが拡大していたとしても問題ないと国は考えているんでしょうか。大臣にお尋ねします。
いずれにいたしましても、現在の法律につきましては、先ほど申し上げました規定になっております。当然、すべての法律、政策につきましては、さまざまな状況が変化に応じてですね、その法律についても検討するということはあり得ると思いますが、現在のところは先ほど申し上げたとおりでございます。
梅村みずほ君。
私、論語が好きなんですけどね、人にして陶器をもんぱかりなければ、必ず近き憂いありっていう言葉があるんですよ。やっぱり政治っていうのは遠く遠く先々のことも考えて、今できること、今やらねばいけないことを考える必要があると思うんですよ。今の大臣のご答弁というのは、大変辛辣な言葉で申し訳ないんですけれども、ご発想が平和だなと思っております。今どんなことに国民が関心を寄せ、不安を抱いているのか、悠長にしている場合ではないということを申し添えたいと思います。高市内閣は外国人政策きっちりおやりになると伺っておりますし、ご期待も申し上げております。我が国は郷に入りでは郷に従いの国なんだということをですね、はっきり言っていただかなければならないんですよ。でもちろんですね、適法に在留し、真面目に働いて、日本社会の一員としてですね、我が国に貢献されているムスリムの方もたくさんいらっしゃることを当然存じ上げております。けれども、価値観や文化、正義は一般的な我々日本人の感覚と異なるところも当然あるわけなんですね。だからこそ社会に受け入れる際には、良い影響もそうでない影響もあるということ。ちゃんと踏まえてですね、それは OK で、これは NG なんだという線引きを政治サイドがきっちりしなければ、地方も困っていくということを申し上げたいと思うんです。でムスリムの方とのこの既存社会との問題っていうのはですね、欧米で今何が起こっているのかっていうことから学ばなきゃいけないんじゃないかと思います。ですね、通告してないんですけども、最後に一言、大臣からもう一度いただけないでしょうか。
上野厚生労働大臣。
先ほど来申し上げておりますとおり、あくまで自治事務と整理をされているものでありますので、地域の事情を踏まえつつ、ご検討をそれぞれ自治体におきましてお願いをできればと考えています。
梅村みずほ君。
今以上の土葬墓地は必要ありません。日本人ファーストの政治をよろしくお願い申し上げまして、質問を終わります。ありがとうございました。
いかがだったでしょうか。梅村議員が何度も問うているのに、厚生労働大臣の答弁は、埋葬に関しては自治体判断の一点張り。ただ答弁書を読むだけで、イライラするばかりだったのではないでしょうか。先ほどもお伝えしたように、世界中に拡散されている梅村さんの発言。しかし西洋の多くの国は、基本、土葬です。では、なぜこの問題に多くの人たちが関心を寄せているのか。それは、埋葬方法に限らず、イスラム教徒とそうでない人たちとの間で、価値観や文化、慣習など、様々な違いが対立の火種となっているからです。その一つに、女性に対する意識というものがあります。そしてもちろん日本の政治家や官僚にとっても、これは知っておかなければいけない事実です。これからご紹介するのは、イスラムの家庭で育ち、後にイスラムから離れることになったイギリス女性の衝撃の告白。イスラム圏の男性は、女性をどのように扱うのか、そもそもコーランには何が書かれているのか、あくまで彼女の意見ではありますが、その驚愕の事実、しっかりとご覧ください。
I'm delighted to be joined by Nuria Khan, who is herself an ex-Muslim and a women's rights activist. Nuria, talk to me about the treatment of women in Islam as a whole. Is it the case that in most Muslim relationships, the woman is seen as secondary to the man?
Holistically, absolutely, yes. So, I mean, if you look at the main tenets of Islam, there's a very rigid set of rules for the definition of marriage and, in fact, the definition of what a male and a woman should kind of adhere to within that marriage. And then it goes further and comes straight from the Quran, where it gives an element of superiority and authority to the male. And the reasoning behind that is that he should be the provider and the breadwinner. But as a result, women get kind of, as you said perfectly, like they are second-class citizens within their own marriage, but also within a wider Islamic society itself. And then there's, you know, if you delve further into that, the concept of marriage becomes problematic in the sense that things that we consider legal here and criminal activities such as marital rape doesn't exist within the Islamic literature itself. Divorce is not something that women can seek independently if they were to abide by the traditional Islamic narrative. So countries have allowed for women to appeal to courts now to get a divorce, but that is called a khulla, and that is something that has come into the fold quite recently. It's not something that Islam itself allows. So you've got this unilateral power that's given to men. So again, you can see the power dynamic is completely off from the get-go.
Talk to me then about what parts of the Quran say about women.
Oh, that's so I mean, basic things, for example, like inheritance. Women would get less inheritance than men. testimonies in court. A woman's testimony is half of a man's, and you need to bring extra female witnesses just in case one of them forgets. And then you've also got a man's kind of role on how to discipline his wife within a marriage, and that alludes itself to domestic violence, which is actually within the Quran itself, Surah 434, which is a surah of the verse of women, and it tells you exactly how to discipline your wife, and that becomes incredibly problematic because the discipline that's ordained is just merely if you fear disobedience. It's just, you know, a general paranoia that a husband could have, for instance. And then, like I said earlier, the unilateral right of divorce is only available to men. So actually women have no get-out clause if you go by the Quran itself. And then the background I come from, Sunni Islam, which is the major sect of Islam, the Sharia tenets are derived from the Quran itself, but also the Sunnah, so like the way of life of the Prophet. And he goes on further there to, you know, call women impure, deficient in intelligence. The impurity relates to the fact that women menstruate, and so you're not allowed to pray or fast during menstruation. So they take something as simple as like a normal bodily function and they turn it into the most loathsome, you know, kind of thing that women should be vilified for. And again, the deficiency in intellect comes down to the Prophet's ruling that a woman's testimony is half of a man's. So you've got all of these things combined with custody. Custody in Islam is once the child becomes 7, regardless of the best interest of the child, it just automatically goes to the man. So yeah, those are kind of the main things, but we could delve deeper into any of those that you'd like.
What I'd like to ask you is what the Quran says about non-Islamic women, especially because in the context of what we're talking about now, and we'll get on to that a bit later, but broadly speaking, whether or not having a huge influx of men from completely different cultures to our own is having an impact on women's safety or is seeing an increase in sexual harassment. So I'm interested to know what the Quran says about how a Muslim man treats a non-Muslim woman.
Yeah, so directly again from the Quran, you've got the verse which addresses Muslim men. The whole Quran pretty much addresses Muslim men anyway, but the verse addresses Muslim men and it asks them to like cover up their women. So that relates to only believing men and believing women, essentially, which are Muslim women in these cases. So within that verse itself, it says to veil your women and make sure they're covered so as to not be harassed. And essentially, that allows for all of this leeway where non-Muslim women who aren't covered or veiled in the same way are allowed or fair game to be kind of harassed or intimidated in the streets. And this is backed up by Islamic history. If you look into it, and if you look into the very origins of the hijab, it was to be able to differentiate as a marker between Muslim women and non-Muslim women in the history of kind of when they would go in to do night raids or where they would, you know, go into other villages or kind of have these battles. They would take the women that they were visibly not Muslim women, and all kinds of sexual violence would be perpetrated against those women. And you've got Islamic scholars, one of the most famous ones from the subcontinent, who's been banned in a lot of countries, but a lot of countries still welcome him, Dr. Zakir Naik. I think he's been banned on Peace TV and Islam TV here in the UK. But he openly says if a woman is not wearing the Muslim veil and she's it's okay to harass her, or she should not complain if she is molested or harassed. So it completely sets like this delineator between Muslim women and non-Muslim women, and that's why you see elements of that appear in the grooming gang cover-ups as well, where disproportionately we see white working class girls being targeted and the things that they were being called during these horrific, you know, acts of sexual violence, the terms that they were being shouted at and screamed at, and the verses of the Quran that were being used to justify the violence against them all kind of stems back to this hijab concept and the concept of veiling and differentiating.
Statistically, when you look at countries that gather this data and publicise this data, it would appear that there is a trend between inward migration, particularly from countries where the culture is predominantly Muslim, and a huge increase in sexual harassment, rape, so on and so forth, particularly when you look at the statistics on rape specifically. Do you think that that there's a potential that we could be seeing a similar phenomenon here in the United Kingdom?
I would say absolutely, because I mean, it's twofold in my opinion, because you've got, as you said, people coming from cultures where a lot of these things that I alluded to earlier, things like marital rape don't exist within the confines of Islam. Things like consent don't exist within the confines of Islam, let alone what the kind of understanding we have of it now. So you've got a huge problem in terms of, a massive culture clash and a massive clash of values altogether in terms of how they view women. But the issue is it goes back to indoctrination. So you've got, let's say, young men who have, absolutely no regard for a woman's body or autonomy or agency. And they think that, for example, a woman sitting with her legs open is asking for it, quote unquote. Or if you're wearing a miniskirt, you're asking for it, quote unquote. But then the other side as well is that you've got this propagation of Muslim women who, again, have been indoctrinated from such an early age to think that they need to be covered up, and anything less than that is also them inviting this to happen. And so they, again, as a believing Muslim woman, you're going to want to cover up and not take part in this moral sin. But what it does is it reinforces the belief that these men have, that they should only be seeing women who are covered up, and that's the only way that they can respect them. I mean, we know that even in Islamic countries, when women are covered from head to toe, there's still sexual abuse and sexual violence that goes on. I've seen it firsthand in Mecca itself, which is the house of God. But yeah, you've got this kind of Stockholm syndrome almost happening with Muslim women as well, which are reinforcing the beliefs of these Muslim men or men coming from Islamic cultures, for them to think that anything other than that is so foreign and in their mind debased as well. So yeah, I think that it's no surprise that when people with such starkly different, and I would say diametrically opposed views come into the country, you're going to see a rise in all kinds of sexual violence.
It's interesting to me that so often the custodians of tolerance, the people who really want to push the agenda that we mustn't be racist, we mustn't be xenophobic, we mustn't criticize different cultures or religions, are so often middle-class white women. And I think to myself, if they understood some of the things you've been saying, they wouldn't do this. Do you think that they have got Islam wrong?
They've definitely got Islam wrong, because if they knew the true Islam, just the way that you and I are talking about things that are extremely problematic within it, then they wouldn't be, so readily holding up placards and, calling for Islamophobia to be made into legislation of its own right and things like that. How women and girls from Muslim households, like I was born in one myself, I kind of understand there's a lot of coercion and, emotional manipulation behind the scenes, whether it's from your elders or from the teachers in the mosque, or peer pressure from other Muslims, or the community policing in itself. And that strips away at the agency and the autonomy and everything else that they think that Muslim women have. And I'm not saying that all Muslim women are, are victims of this. Some very much are probably wearing the hijab and the burqa off their own volition. But primarily that's few and far between, and those are women who have been raised in the West and they know they've got added protections to help them. But in general, I think if, like you said, if the middle class kind of, I guess, liberal value champions were to read the Quran verse for verse, or just read the verse of women that's dedicated to women, that in itself can give you a sneak peek into how problematic Islam is for women. And then maybe they wouldn't be so kind of just trying to stand by them, when actually that's at the detriment of every other kind of group in society. Now, you can be, living comfortably in the UK and be a middle-class white woman and think that this is a problem that only happens in theocracy. Well, this is exactly what we would get here if we were to allow this to run amok.
Do you think as well that among some sections of the Muslim community, that white women are a free-for-all, that they're sort of exoticized because they have that, the access, because they don't wear the hijab or the burqa, or they're non-Muslim, but also because of the prevalence of porn culture?
Oh, I hate to say it, but absolutely, yes, absolutely. And I mean, this starts from like the grassroots level of, if you were to be, let's say, in, just privy to, let's say, locker room talk or talk within groups of Muslim young men, you would already see the kind of denigration of white women in their eyes, in terms of, we can mess around and have a good time with all of these women, but then we'll marry a good Muslim wife. And that's kind of the general MO of most young Muslim men. I would say young British Muslim men as well, you know, when they want to have their fun. That's the kind of, like you said, whether it's porn, the result of porn having fetishized them more, but then also Islam in itself. And if you go back to, again, Islamic history, there have been expeditions where Muhammad has been riling up his followers to go and conquer new territories and, you know, capture blonde-haired women. So it very much goes back all the way to Islamic history in itself and the Prophet's view of these women, and then how it carries on. And of course, as you said, porn has just only reinforced that.
How prevalent do you think those attitudes are within Islamic culture in the UK or in the Western world?
I would say it's very prevalent. I would say that. It hurts me to say that, but I would. And that's why it was infuriating when, you know, the kind of lens was not shed on that aspect of things with the whole grooming gang scandal and the cover-up, because it's very much linked to that notion of these, who are the most vulnerable segment of society that we can target, and who does our religion give us the justification to target in that sense. And that's where that came together. So that's not a time to be worried about being called racist or Islamophobic. That's where you need to tackle the problem head on, because they are disproportionately targeting a certain type of vulnerable young demographic. And those are always, with Islam, it's women and children that, you know, are the first casualty.
Okay, so what do we need to do now in the United Kingdom?
We need to look at what's being said in our mosques. What are the sermons that are being said in Arabic as well in some of these wider central London mosques, so everyone is aware of the kind of message they're putting out to, especially like second and third generation British immigrants, you know, children of immigrants, who we'd expect to have kind of become more British at this point, but instead we see a regression. And that's when it becomes horrible for when you talk about Vogue or trying to end Vogue in this country, because you've got you're channeling out young Muslim men with that same mindset that they would have in Islamic countries. And then yet you're trying to protect women and girls from that same very thing, really getting serious about how we end violence against women and girls. If there's whichever religion it may come from, if there is a religious text that endorses domestic violence or says this is a God-ordained solution to marital problems, and we refuse to accept that when we're trying to deal with these cases. And I work in the sector, and I've seen that Muslim men actually quote the Quran verbatim as their right to, you know, beat their wives black and blue. And again, all the way back from Muhammad's time, you can trace that this has been happening. So whether you're talking about non-Muslim women like we were earlier, you're completely at the behest of being one of these sexual victims, because again, the ideology allows that. But on the flip side, Muslim women as well have no get out, and they are allowed to be beaten, and it's justified.
You're an ex-Muslim. Talk to me about your experiences as a Muslim and what led you to leaving the religion.
Sure. So essentially, I was brought up in a, you know, typical conservative Sunni Muslim family. So with that just came, I guess, the normal things side by side to your normal schooling. You'd attend mosque and Quran classes, and you'd be taught about Islam and things like that. So you'd be encouraged to do things like wear hijab or follow kind of the tenets of Islam as you get older. But again, because I was growing up in London, it was kind of a mix of both worlds that I was subjected to. It was only when I left the UK and kind of experienced life in Saudi Arabia, and then beyond that in the UAE, where I saw kind of a different flavor of Islam and how they interpret it, and how general like life is in a strict Islamic country, that I kind of had the other side exposed to me. So I was kind of just teetering between what is Islam and what's the Islam that my parents follow. So we kind of just charted a I guess, semi-conservative course in that sense. So I wasn't forced to wear hijab, but I chose to wear it off my own volition, because that's what my Quran teacher at mosque encouraged me to do while I was still in London, and I was 9 years old. So again, most people, that's naturally implied at home within your families. And thankfully I didn't have that little element, but I chose to do it myself regardless, because it was the right thing to do. And obviously, naturally, as a young Muslim woman, I wanted to go to heaven. So yeah, it was kind of just seeing a mixture of Islamic experiences, and then having a run-in with Sharia law myself as a grown Muslim woman kind of dealing with a divorce and trying to get myself out of a certain situation, the full force of Sharia kind of fell down on me. And that's what it took for me to look into actually what Islamic law prescribes for women and what that means pragmatically. And that's kind of what really opened my eyes when I went back to reading the sources instead of just listening to what I was told and fed as a child. I had kind of studied elements of Islamic law, so I looked into it with a lot more of an open mind, and I had a safe space to do that because growing up in the Middle East, everything was kind of policed. Like couldn't even Google actual Islamic sources or valid criticisms of them because, you know, the web was obviously, you're not allowed to do that in Saudi Arabia or Dubai. And if you do, you could get into a lot more trouble because everything is really heavily monitored. Yeah.
For life in the United Kingdom as a woman, my experience has been that it's changed dramatically. Even when I'm living in West London, in the last 3.5 years, I feel it's changed dramatically. That when I walk down the street, I get harassed, I get leered at in a way that I didn't used to. And I just wanted to know whether that is something that you're also experiencing. That's when you go about life, I don't particularly dress immodestly, but when you go about life, you're an extremely attractive woman. You know, are you finding that you are having unwanted attention, and is that coming from a certain subset of society?
So I come from a similar part of London to you, and I have literally seen the kind of metamorphosis of, you know, simple things like going on a night out. How would you plan to even get from home to, let's say, the tube or whatever if you are? And like yourself, I don't really go out, you know, dressing, you know, showing loads of skin and stuff. Maybe that's my Islamic background that I haven't been able to shed fully. But I find it extremely uncomfortable, and I don't really put myself in those positions just because of experiences that I have had. I would say, though, again, and this is the weird thing about this, people who, let's say, are not aware of my activism just by my skin color and the way I look. Muslim men, obviously you get catcalled and you get leered at and things like that, but I feel like they wouldn't cross that line. So again, I've got it from men of all kinds of ethnicities and nationalities, which is the reason, like in general, that I kind of, you know, put my safety first and I choose different routes, or I'd just Uber it directly. But I feel like Muslim men push it to a level, but if they think you are one of them, quote unquote, they do kind of draw the line at maybe a comment here or there, and then they'll leave it at that. Which again this is what I'm saying, people don't talk about this enough, of how differently they view white women.
And talk to people about this, whether my lived experience as a blonde-haired woman is different to other people's lived experience. Certainly, you know, having just come back from Morocco, a country that I really love, it's like flies to flypaper, you know, it'll moth to a flame. It's a sort of, you know, it's almost an encouragement. If I walk down the street with long blonde hair, it seems to be...
Yeah, and I'm sorry to bring this back, but to touch on your point about porn earlier, it's also because a lot of these Muslim men have watched porn, and, you know, the majority of women that they've seen in porn are blonde-haired women. And so therefore, again, with no concept or no understanding of how you should, you know, like how we treat one another in normal society, they project that into real life. And they actually think that white women are looser, or white women have, you know, looser morals, or they're asking for it by virtue of the way that they dress, or just because of their culture is not as rigid or one that is Islam.
ご視聴ありがとうございました。